Hi, class, and welcome to Intro to Psych, Chapter 1, The Science of Psychology. So, today we're going to break down what psychology is. We're going to talk about where it came from and how we study psychology. So, what is psychology? Well, psychology, the word, comes from the term psyche, Greek for mind, and this idea of ology, or the field of study. So, the study of the mind. So we can think about this as the internal processes, our thoughts, as well as our external processes, how those thoughts affect our behaviors. And this is based on not just questions that we might make up, but objective, verifiable, scientific evidence. Right? It is a science, as we bring up. So if you think about the definition the book uses of psychology, it is a science that seeks to understand behavior and mental processes and apply that understanding to the service of human welfare. So let's look at that definition and see some of the important aspects of it. First word, as I've already mentioned, that jumps out is the word science. Right? Psychology is a science. It is the study of it, and it is a rigorous science at that. So it is important to understand that we are not just asking questions like, well, what did you think about your mother? We are looking at this like we would try to understand any other animal. You'll notice that we also talk about behavior. Well, behavior is an interesting thing because when you think about psychology, it's about the mind and thoughts. Our mind and our thoughts control our behaviors. They tell us what to do. So that's a very important aspect of this, right? We can think about how we can change people's behaviors by having them do different things. In this example here, right? Talking to a child differently might change their behavior, as well as those mental processes, what we think about this. Now, when we talk about psychology, right, so we are understanding the behaviors that people do and the thoughts or mental processes that cause us to do those. But that's not all psychology is. It's also about how we use that stuff for good, right? That idea of using that to apply this to be better for others. Now, in terms of what psychologists do, well, I think a lot of people will come into this class believing that most psychologists are related to mental health research. Many of us aren't related to that. And I would say only maybe about 40-ish% of psychologists deal with major things like mental health, that kind of area. Most of us don't do anything related to that. I am a psychologist who studies how people interact with the world and one another and the types of thoughts they have after negative events. But if you think about some of the major psychological areas today, there's a lot of people who are interested in the biological portion of this, right? So the brain and our nervous system, what we're going to cover in the next chapter, chapter 2. There's also people interested in developmental psychology, right? How we come to be from very young to adults and right, aging. We can talk about this and related to how are people like twins growing up to be different even though they look so similar. Cognitive psychology, so understanding the thoughts and the ways that we think or try to understand the brain. Social and personality psychology, so why are we similar? Why are we different? How do we work in groups? And finally, clinical psychology, so this idea of psychology related to abnormal behaviors or mental health in general. Now, what's fascinating about that is this relates very much to our model that we're going to be using this semester, the 5-pillar model. And so during this semester, we are going to be covering information from each of these 5 pillars, starting with biological, then moving to development, cognitive, social and personality, and ending the course with thinking about mental health. And you can't quite see that because of my face over here, but at the beginning of the semester, we are going to focus more on the very specific, very unique information that's really related to how these cells are interacting with each other. Right? How does the brain work? All the way up to understanding how watching what other people do affects us or how our culture makes us who we are. And we're going to be looking at psychology in a lot of different lenses, very microscopically at first. But by the end of the semester, we'll be talking about this in terms of relations to groups and the world. One thing you may have noticed as I'm going through this, as I should mention, is that I am doing this all in one take. So if I do make a mistake, there's a very likely chance I will pause my video, figure out what I made my mistake on, and come back and correct myself. Just like teaching in person, there's going to be a couple mistakes throughout these videos. My apologies. But as I'm moving on here, I want to ask, isn't psych just common sense? Doesn't it just make sense with what the world is? Well, in reality, science outdoes anecdotes. And what I mean by that is your experiences in the world might vastly differ from my experiences in the world, and we don't experience things in the same way. The best way of describing this in my own life is, right, you think about the idea of wearing a seatbelt, right? We know common sense says that wearing a seatbelt is very important. I always tell people about this accident that my mother got into. My mother was actually in an accident. The wreck ended up looking a lot like this. This isn't the exact picture, but my mom was actually thrown through the windshield because she wasn't wearing her seatbelt, and that's probably the reason she survived. So I always like to tell that story because common sense is wear your seatbelt, but had my mom actually worn her seatbelt, she wouldn't be here with me to tell that story. So I always like to bring this up because it may be the case I say something in this class and you go, but that isn't true for me. It happens. But generally, for most people, things that I mention ought to be kind of in the direction I'm talking about. So when you think about what psychology is versus what it isn't, psychology is more than just the study of mental disorders and treatment. It's not reading minds, and it's not common sense, but it is this scientific field that is growing, and it's a lot more unique than just why is somebody crazy, which is not how we talk. Moving on to where did psych come from? Well, let's talk about five major branches, well, I should say five major historical perspectives or schools of thought in psychology. Now, when we start on this, I always like to bring up the interesting question of deciding when psychology starts. It's kind of tricky to decide when we first think about psychology because we've been wondering about people's behavior and their thoughts since ancient Greece, right? Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. But the problem with thinking about these guys as psychologists is it's not very science-y, right? This is just thinking. This isn't doing experiments or testing, something we'll talk about at the end of this chapter. So what you want to know is that while we've always been thinking about psychology and studying and understanding the mind, we didn't really start psychology as a science until electricity was already harnessed for us. It wasn't until 1879, just about 150 years ago, that our man Wilhelm Wundt here created a lab and started to run psychology experiments. So these experiments have been around for about 150 years. Compare that to physics, which has run experiments for at least 5,000 years. The difference in terms of the knowledge gained in the levels of these two sciences is incredible. So I always tell people that psychology is a science, but it's a very young science that is trying its hardest to understand the brain, something that I can't take out of your head and get you to tell me about. It has to stay in there. Right? And we are learning about psychology through lots of different ways and perspectives, as you will see here. Excuse my computer telling me I need to update something. And you'll notice that while there have been a lot of goofy theories over time, they are all starting to converge on one another to make a single unified theory of why people are the way they are. So with that in mind, let's discuss 5 different historical perspectives of psychology. And these are going to mostly be in the order that we have encountered them. So let's start with structuralism. So back in 1879, excuse me, back in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt was interested in the structure of this, right? Breaking consciousness down into its elements. So looking at the structure of consciousness. How do we do something like that? Well, we use something called introspection. Introspection is going to be the idea of looking inwards, intro, right? Inwards, spection, like glasses, spectacles. So what you want to think about this is that, right, Wilhelm Wundt comes along and says, well, why don't we start asking people about what they're thinking about? Another person, Edward Titchener, somebody who I'm not going to discuss more than this, he also wanted people to describe what they were seeing in terms of physical sensations. How bright is this light? How loud is this music? And so when we think about, though, introspection, we can break this down into the sensations that you're experiencing. So the quality of the sensation, the intensity or the clearness, right? If I asked you to think about your mother, for instance, how clear is she in your mind? How intense is that thought? We can also think about feelings, right? If I ask you questions about your mother, that might bring pleasurable feelings. You might love your mother. You might have difficulties with your mother. It might bring you displeasurable feelings. And you could imagine that this is going to be at least one way to ask people, what is it like to think about things? When it comes to introspection, there's a couple pros, right? This allows us to look inward, and it allows us to finally get into some sort of objective, not subjective, right, factual way to test these thoughts. But it's still very subjective. Your way of thinking about things is vastly different than my way of thinking about things. And it's very hard to train individuals to do this well. If I were to ask you right now, what are you thinking about? That probably has changed the type of thought that you are thinking at the moment. So structuralism, though, is this great idea of let's introspect on the structure of our thoughts. Our next kind of theory comes briefly afterwards, and it's called functionalism. So if structuralism is about the structure of thoughts, functionalism's about the function of thoughts. How consciousness is functional. It helps us adapt and do things, right? It helps us to make decisions. How is it that we can make decisions and, choose things like what shirt should I wear today? Well, our consciousness is useful. So this is a guy called William James is related to this. He's asking the why and the how. Why do we function the way that we do? How are these behaviors adaptive or useful? How do they help us in a society? And this is actually one of our theories of emotion we'll talk about later, comes from William James. The idea that emotions are adaptive and functional in our lives, which they are. So if you were to look at the difference between structuralism and functionalism, structuralism is looking at breaking these thoughts and mental activities down into their most basic components. Right? You can think about this as taking a house down into its bricks. Whereas functionalism is walking through the house and seeing what each room or kind of why it is the way it is. Why is there a roof on the house? Well, so there's not water in it. Right? Why is it that we have emotions? Well, maybe to help us react. So if you think about this in terms of like physically, structuralism would be like looking at the bones of a skeleton and seeing what they're made of. Whereas functionalism is looking at why those bones do the things they do. Why does my arm bone allow me to move this way versus what is it made out of? So hopefully that helps you understand this idea of structuralism versus functionalism. Moving on from there, we can discuss this idea of psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis, right, studying the brain and the analysis of that. This is Sigmund Freud, somebody that you've probably heard of if you know anything about psychology. So Sigmund Freud was interested in the idea that our unconscious brain, these thoughts that are going on in the back of our mind, how they are affecting us. And he argued that there were kind of different impulses in our mind. The same thing as having the devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, telling us, don't do any work versus I need to do that work because I'm a good person, right? So imagining how you can figure out what to do in a situation that is causing you a little bit of turmoil. So psychoanalysis, the therapy, is bringing those non-conscious thoughts to your conscious awareness. So thinking about how your early childhood might have affected you, how certain repressed memories or unconscious motivations. Freud would be the kind of guy to say something along the lines of, oh, it sounds like you are worried that your mother didn't love you. Now, that's pretty untestable, and it's hard to test some of this. It's not really falsifiable, but it does give us some interesting techniques and ideas. And so, how did Freud even study this? How did he get past our normal conscious everyday mind to our unconsciousness? Well, he would ask people about their dreams. He called those the royal road to the unconscious. So that, in that kind of way of thinking, we are thinking about how your consciousness is going to be like, this is a weird example, but if you've ever been drinking and you have sent a text, Freud would argue that your sober mind serves as kind of a gatekeeper to your consciousness. And so the idea is that when you've been drinking, maybe you send a text that you shouldn't have. When you're dreaming, you can't have that guard similar to, speaking your mind when you're drunk. Your dreams are going to be speaking your true thoughts. He also maybe would use hypnotism or free association techniques, looking at trying to get you to understand who you are deep down beneath the surface. From there, we move on to a different technique called the Gestalt technique. And Gestalt is actually against breaking consciousness down into components. It goes along with a phrase you may have heard, that the whole of the conscious experience is greater than the sum of its parts, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if you look at this picture over here, and I were to ask you what you see, many people would say, oh, I see two triangles. Well, do you actually see two triangles? Because two triangles are made out of lines, and there's no lines here. What you're seeing is kind of a broken image, but this is what Gestalt is. It's the idea that our brains can fill in the gaps and understand things. For instance, if I were to ask you what this picture on the screen is, you probably wouldn't say a bicycle. However, your brain is able to make sense of these things. So if you were to read this sentence, this paragraph I should say here, you'll notice that all of the letters are misspelled. However, the first and last letter are in the right place, and your mind is able to use those cues to make sense of the world together. So the Gestalt is kind of the opposite of structuralism. It is going to be keeping this more like functionalism, that our brain is able to function and use all of these components together. From here, we take a very strange turn in the history of psychology. So we're going to now talk about behaviorism. Now, behaviorism is interesting because, well, for psychologists, behaviorists don't care about thought. They don't care about what you're thinking. They're arguing that behavior is primarily the result of how you learn to do things. And this is Watson and Skinner. You may have heard of these people before, but this is your Pavlov's dog type thinking, right? That we can train a dog or a human being just by giving them rewards and punishments, not asking them how they feel. And this lasted for a really long time. And this helps explain how we can train both animals and children. Now, I'm not going to show this video, but if you were to watch this video, you'll notice that this is B.F. Skinner himself, who is able to train an actual pigeon how to spin around in a circle very briefly by just giving it rewards when it should be rewarded. Now, behaviorism hasn't lasted forever, right? We do know that our thoughts do matter. So when it comes to beyond behaviorism, we have now taken more of a cognitive approach. So thinking about the mind. And one thing that the brain really seems to work a lot like is a computer. Excuse me. So this cognitive approach emphasizes the fact that We are bringing information into our brain just like you might type information in on a keyboard. We're doing something with that information and then it's being sent back out. Beyond that, there's info like there's more areas like cognitive neuroscience and biopsychology. So, understanding the nervous system and how certain processes are activated in certain regions of the brain. Evolutionary psychology, or the study of how behaviors can have evolved and are adaptive to us. And lastly, one I like to talk about is the cultural approach. This idea that different cultures, Eastern cultures versus Western cultures, may act differently, and that affects how we live our lives in the ways that we act. But do note that the majority of what you are talking about and learning about here is going to be these 5 approaches: structuralism, functionalism, Gestalt, psychoanalysis, and behaviorism. So, to give you a question that you would maybe see on an exam or something similar to that, imagine that your friend Dave walks into his dorm room and finds his roommate staring at an apple. Dave asks what his roommate's doing, and his roommate says, "I'm trying to describe the quality and intensity of the apple." What technique is Dave using? Well, he is using introspection. He is looking inwards and trying to understand the quality and intensity of this object. Not necessarily a thought, but he's still looking inward. Another question you might see on an exam: imagine that a guest on a TV show is talking about their struggles with depression, and they explain that the type of therapist they're going to see talks about how their problems are due to these unconscious inner conflicts and mental toil that's going on. What kind of perspective do you think that therapist would follow? Well, you've been paying attention, it should be the psychoanalytic perspective. Why? Because we are looking at that unconscious conflict, not the structure of your thoughts, not your behaviors, and humanistic is not something we've discussed. So, hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the questions that you might see on an exam. So, let's get back to it. Why are we studying psychology? Well, because it's interesting to know why people's thoughts and behaviors make them do the things they do. But how do we study this? Well, scientifically, When we think back to the goals of psychology, it's to describe what's going on, to make predictions about what people are doing, to know that these certain variables are causing certain things, We want to know that the reason somebody is sad is because they are depressed, and be able to explain those with confidence, not just saying, I don't know why it happened. And to do that, what do? Well, we use the scientific method. We have a question. You run a hypothesis. We research that hypothesis, analyze the data, make a theory as to why we found what we found, and then repeat the process. Psychology, more or less, is the idea of studying why we do what we do. And how do we do that? We ask people questions, we see how they react. So an important thing to note about this are 2 important phrases or things that we are going to talk about. We're going to talk about variables, something you've probably heard since 3rd grade, as well as this idea of an operational definition, something you maybe haven't heard of yet. So let's just start with the idea of variables, What we are measuring. There's 2 types of variables we can talk about. Independent variables, variables that we are going to manipulate. Independent, they're going to be able to change. However, there's also dependent variables. These are what we are measuring and expecting to change. So for instance, if I wanted to see whether reading during the afternoon or the evening lets you read more words per minute, the independent variable of when you're reading, afternoon or evening, is going to be what is being changed, hopefully. But everybody is going to be reading words, and we're going to count how many words they're going to read. That's the idea of a variable, And so you can imagine, a non-psychology example. If you have plants, If you want to have a plant and see how well they grow, you might water some plants weekly and some plants daily. And then look at the dependent variable there. See that it looks like, based on my fake data here, watering your plant daily makes it grow more. But you can add also more information to that, right? Not just one variable, but two. I could also add a couple plants where I give some plants daily water, some plants weekly water. Some plants I put them out in the sun occasionally, and some plants maybe I leave them locked in a closet. Maybe some of these plants I also do occasionally or not. And you can see kind of a bigger set of data here where all of these are independent versions of or levels of a variable, but measuring this dependent growth here. So dependent variables are only going to have that one level. Now, a joking example I always like to use when it comes to this other one is operational definitions. So, right, when we talk about operational definitions, we are talking about how we define something. For a lot of research in other fields, this is really easy. How far away is something? Measure it in feet or inches or meters. But how do you measure happiness? How do you, right? Is it the number of times somebody smiles? What is it? Right? And so this idea of an operational definition, a clear and concise measure, right? We might think about something like a plant and a baby, my daughter here. These have to grow, both of these things. But I don't think I want to use the same definition for a variable for growth because I don't want to feed my daughter soil. And I don't think it would be helpful to give a plant baby food. Right? So these are certain things that might affect this to help both of these things grow. Now, a silly example I like to give in class that I won't make you guys work on is, but think about what a sandwich is. How would you define a sandwich? A lot of people say something between two pieces of bread. So is 3 pieces of bread a sandwich? I don't think so. If you say that a sandwich is just something between, right, a piece of meat between 2 pieces of bread, is that a sandwich? Are these sandwiches? A lot of interesting questions here. And while silly, this brings us to the point of you can measure things very differently here. So if you think about things like kindness or aggression or honesty, how would we measure these? Well, we need to operationally define that measurement. So kindness can be measured in a lot of different ways. For instance, one study has looked at how likely you are to help somebody who, on purpose drops their books in front of you. Are you going to pick up some books? The more books you pick up, the kinder you are. Now, I'm not saying this is perfect, but in one study, this might be a useful way to measure this. Another example is aggression. How can we measure aggression? Well, of course, we could just ask somebody, how rude are you? Would you punch this guy? But in another study, they looked at doing a game between 2 different people. And if you lost your version of the game, you could have a noise blasted in your ears. And so the winner would get to blast noises in their ears. And so we measured how loud you would blast that noise into people's ears and for how long. Because an aggressive person would make you listen to that loud and annoying noise for longer. And how would you measure honesty? It's not really easy to ask people how honest you are. That's not a good way to do that. Can I find a different way? For instance, one way we could measure honesty, we could define honesty by the numbers of pieces of candy taken when we ask kids to take some candy through a one-way mirror that says take only 1 piece. Were kids honest that they only took 1 piece of candy? Something of this sort. So another question for you here. Imagine that Ernest here has collected and examined some data and now has a set of principles that he feels make sense of personality, why personality happens. What do you think he's formed about personality? Again, the answer is a theory of personality, a set of general principles. It's not just a hypothesis about what specifically is going to happen, but something more general. Another question here, right? In a study of aggression, Dr. Jones defines this, his term aggression as any time when a child's hands makes an audible contact with another individual. This description of aggression is a operational definition. Why is it an operational definition? Because it's how we are defining aggression. Aggression could be defined as the number of times a kid yells at somebody else, verbal aggression. But here we're choosing to define it as hitting, right? Physical aggression. Alrighty, moving on from there, How do we study psychology? Well, we're going to talk about our first type of research, descriptive research. And under descriptive research, we have some different ways we can do descriptive research. So the first thing to know about descriptive research is that the goal of it is in the name. It's to describe, right? To be descriptive about this and hopefully predict behaviors and mental processes. Now, we can do this by naturally observing people, by looking at small groups of people who fit specific criteria, called a case study. We can also run surveys as well as correlational studies. So to kind of describe this descriptive research observation, right, naturalistic observation, this is the idea of just going somewhere and observing what people do. So there's a really interesting study in social psychology where one social psychologist joined a cult, and he just sat down in the back and followed along and saw what happened to individuals in the cult. How did they respond to these cult-like activities? So that's really cool because, right, doing that is a really realistic setting. However, you can only describe what's going on. You can't explain why these things are happening, and you don't want to be creepy. You don't want to be the guy who's hiding in the corner where nobody knows, nobody knows why you're there. So also, in case you're worried that somebody's watching you, for instance, if I sat right directly behind you while you were taking your exam, that might make you feel a little awkward. And not only that, maybe the observer is looking for something specific that you're not really sure of. Lastly, there's poor control in this, in the sense that you don't know why exactly things are happening this way. You don't have much what we call internal validity over this. The next one we talk about is case studies, right? And maybe you've heard of Phineas Gage, the man who had a rod put through his head from an accident. This is a really interesting person to study. However, we're not going to go put rods through people's heads so we can see how this works for other people. So a case study is examining a very rare or specific situations. It's very detailed and it's about very specific thing. However, we don't know if this would happen to everybody if they had a spike put through their head. Chances are most people wouldn't make it, right? And so we can't necessarily repeat the results onto another person. Moving on to surveys. So surveys are interesting in the sense that they are what the majority of psychologists use. I use surveys all the time in my research. Questionnaires, right, that just kind of ask you your thoughts on certain thing. It might ask you to answer a few questions. How do you feel about this? What are your thoughts on X, Y, or Z? You can get lots of information really fast, but the way you word question matters, right? So the difference between, asking you guys, I thought this was the best class ever versus I enjoyed this class, you get different answers. The response bias, certain people might want to respond in a certain way, right? Hearing it, right, this idea of a loaded question, and this idea of sampling errors. Who takes surveys? People who like taking surveys. You might get different people who take surveys than you think would take the survey. You might not get everybody in the world who gets your survey might not take it. Another question for you here. In 1920, John Watson attempted to demonstrate that he could create a phobia of rats in a 9-month-old named Albert, something we will talk about in the learning chapter. What example type research method is this? It is a case study. Why is it a case study? Well, it's on a specific child, on a specific circumstance. It was also pretty unethical, but it is something, right, that doesn't fit a survey or observational methods. Now, the last type of research that we will talk about in the descriptive section are correlational studies. In correlational, it's in the name, correlation, the relationship between two variables. How are two variables related to one another? And so the beauty of this is that you can test different predictions and suggest hypotheses, but note that correlation isn't causation. We can't manipulate things like demographics, like whether you are 10 or 20 or 30. We can't manipulate whether you are male or female. That is something that just happens. So correlational studies are how these two variables, these covariables, are related to each other. And we have different types of correlations. We can have positive correlations. So positive correlations are when a certain variable goes up, the other variable goes up. As one increases, the other increases. So for example, the amount of time studying for an exam, as that goes up, the amount of points you get for an exam also goes up. Right? As one increases, the other increases. We can also talk about a negative correlation. As one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So a good example of that would be for the amount of hours I exercise, the number of pounds I have goes down, actually, right? So as my exercise goes up, my weight goes down. Then there are correlations that are zero correlations. They have no predictive value. They don't predict anything. So, right, you could imagine a correlation that, in this case, they use the example that the phases of the moon is related to the number of crimes, which there is no relationship between whether it's a full moon or not and whether there will be crimes committed. So correlations are something that we're going to talk about throughout this class. There are a lot of research we do. There's something you're probably going to see in your life outside of this class as well. So I like to describe how we actually study and use this. So this is something you might see when you see a correlation, and you're going to see this called R, which is your correlation coefficient. I like to think about this as R for relationship, right? So the relationship between these two variables is, and it's either positive or negative, like we said on that last slide. Positive means as one goes up, the other goes up. Negative, as one goes up, the other goes down. And this number will be between 1 and -1. So a positive correlation, a perfect correlation would be a 1-to-1, right? So there's no really good 1-to-1 correlations I can think of other than for every one, every 15 miles I drive, I lose 1 gallon of gasoline type thing, right? That would be a perfectly negative correlation, that every time one of this happens, another thing happens. Now, this direction also tells us, right, if it's together or different. Now, so right, the positive side, these are both going together, whereas the negative side, these variables would be in the opposite direction. So hopefully that makes sense to you. To give you a little quiz on this, to see, you've got 3 correlations down at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to ask you these questions in order. So which of these graphs has a positive correlation? That's going to be B. Which of these graphs has a negative correlation? A, as right, these are going down, right, as the room brightness is increasing. Here, the happiness score is decreasing. The next one, which correlation is the strongest of the 3, and that's going to be looking at these numbers here. You'll see it is, right, 0.47, right? Now, what's interesting to note is that, right, if this was negative 0.48, 0.48 is bigger than 0.47, so this would be a stronger correlation. The negative doesn't mean smaller, it just means the direction is opposite, so keep that in mind as well. Finally, what is the weakest correlation? Well, the one we haven't talked about yet. The one that has a 0.05 correlation, that's pretty much no correlation here. So to get to that idea, right, of hearing about correlations, how one thing is related to another, it's important to know correlation isn't causation. You may hear examples about this a lot, right? This idea that in this example I'm going to give, that coffee is suspected as a cause of heart attacks. That there is a positive correlation between the numbers of coffees drank and the likelihood of having a heart attack. The more coffee, the more likelihood of a heart attack. Now, is it really the case that it's drinking more coffee? Or could it be some other factor? Well, one other factor we can think about is age. Age is a factor in how much coffee people drink. Older people tend to drink more coffee, and older people are also more likely to have a heart attack. So is it the case that drinking coffee is going to cause me to get a heart attack? Not necessarily. I think another example to really sell this idea is the fact that a recent study of soldiers stationed at army bases found that the more tattoos a soldier has, the more likely they are to get into a motorcycle accident. Just a little strange, because a motorcycle accident shouldn't relate to tattoos. If I went and got another tattoo, that shouldn't make me drive worse. Well, what is the underlying factor here? Is there something else that might matter? Well, who are we talking about? Soldiers, people who have chosen an inherently risky job, people who have decided to do something more dangerous. What's related to the number of tattoos? The amount of time, right, that you're spent in the military, I would assume, or the amount of time. The older you are, the more tattoos you have. And the longer you ride a motorcycle, the better the chance that you'll get into an accident. So you'll notice that this is only for people who take risks, and this is only really talking about, hey, people who take risks for longer are more likely to have consequences of those risks. So you can see why thinking deeper about this might help you to understand why it's not just surface level that getting tattoos makes you wreck your motorcycle. It's important to recognize that you can never assume causation from correlation, because one example might be this reverse causation. Is it the case that married people are more likely to be happy? Right? Or is it the case that happy people are more likely to be married? Additionally, there's this idea of reciprocal causation. This idea that, right, is it the case that helping people increases happiness? Or does happiness increase helping? In which case, do these kind of just work together reciprocally? And not only that, your variables should make sense as to why they correlate. There's lots of random correlations out there. For instance, there's a strong correlation between the amount of chocolate consumed and the number of Nobel Prizes your country will win. See Switzerland at the top here with the most chocolate consumed and the most Nobel Prizes. Why is this the case? Well, if you know, Switzerland is the country that gives out Nobel Prizes, so they tend to give out more Nobel Prizes to Swiss people. Switzerland is also known for its chocolate, so they probably eat more chocolate than somebody not known as much for their chocolate. So hopefully this gives you an idea of why we would be useful to use correlational research, but it's not the end-all, be-all, which is why we have experimental research. Experimental research, in my mind, is what we think of when we think of true psych research. And the idea here is, again, going to be to describe and understand human nature. Whereas in descriptive research, right, we were describing this, we're also planning to predict behaviors in experimental research. And so to do that, we are going to manipulate an independent variable and measure its effect on that dependent variable, where the independent variable is going to be, right, manipulated. We're going to make differences in it. We're going to give some people a happy video to watch and some people a sad video to watch, and then see how it makes them feel with a dependent variable. So we might also compare our results to a different group, right? As I mentioned, a sad group compared to a happy group. So you can think about this in terms of depression treatments. We might give one group of people who are depressed a new drug trial, and that's the experiment. The other group might get a control treatment, which is, a fake pill. And we might see, is there a difference between the group who gets something and the group who doesn't? Well, how do we decide who gets something and who doesn't? Well, that kind of comes back to a big question here of how to do psychological research. Well, the first thing to note is our goal is to try to randomly select people from a population. I don't want to only take psychology majors to understand how human nature works. I want to take everybody. I want to learn about everybody in the world, not just the few people here. But depending on who you get to take your study, you can randomly select from that group of people, but you are going to randomly assign a group of people into either the experimental condition or the control condition, right? So you have every person in the world or in your group that you're going to get here, and you take some of them. Some of those people are going to get your experimental treatment, the new depression drug. Some of them might get a sugar pill or the old depression drug, and we see how that affects you. Now, this is really useful in the sense that it allows us to compare cause and effect. However, there's still some problems in here. Depending on how you run the experiment, there might be some issues. But to give you guys a basic idea of what we're talking about, right? An in-class experiment that I could do if we were in person is I might imagine, right, based on my hypothesis, that having pleasant images is going to increase your happiness. Seeing something that makes you happy makes you feel better. And I might randomly assign you based on where you sit in a classroom as to do something. So, of course, we're not in a classroom, but you imagine that I show half of the class this picture, and I ask them how they feel. And then I show the other half of the class these pictures, puppies, and I ask them how they feel. And then I compare groups 1 and groups 2 in how they felt. Now, the beauty of that is that simple experiment covers everything we've talked about from the second half of this lecture, right? We've talked about how I used a theory and a hypothesis, and I operationalized happiness by putting puppies right there. How did I operationalize measuring happiness? I just asked you, how happy are you? I manipulated the independent variable, which group you were in. I randomly assigned you. There was a dependent variable. Now, are there problems with this experiment? Certainly, it's not the best, but overall, it gives us a little indication whether some people like something more than another thing. The last topic for today is this idea of reliability and validity. So unlike other sciences, we can't just pull out a tape measure and see how happy you are. We have to figure out if our results, or the things that we're measuring, are measuring what, right, the way we want them to, and they're measuring what we want them to begin with. So let's start off with this idea of reliability, this consistency. For instance, you hope that your scale at home is consistent. You hope that every time you hop on it, it says the weight that you are. You hope that you don't hop on the scale and then step off and then step back on and it says 10 pounds difference. That's going to be a problem. That's not a reliable scale. A reliable scale means that we should be able to find what we would expect most of the time. So if I take a survey on how happy I am and I am in a really good mood, and then I take a survey again and I'm in a really good mood, I should score high on both of those. But also, we might not expect things to be always reliable. I'm probably not going to be happy every day, but I do hope that on the days that I am happy, it shows that I am, right, reliably happy. So that idea of reliability, of course, you want something that is consistent. The other one we talk about is validity, valid, true. Is this a good measurement? So for instance, if I wanted to measure marriage satisfaction, right? How happy are you with your wife or your husband? I could ask people, do you like your husband or wife? That's one way to ask it. I could ask them a question, be like, do you want to get divorced? Are those the same questions? Not really. And, are the questions that we're asking really a good measure of this, right? The idea of are IQ tests really a good measurement of intelligence? Not, right? Having a average IQ or an above average IQ or a below average IQ doesn't necessarily put you out of any specific job or anything like that. So it's the idea that, right, are we actually testing what we should? And so there is this wonderful picture of this idea of reliability versus validity, right? So this might be reliable because we're getting the same answer, but it's not valid because it's not hitting the mark. We need this to both hit the mark and consistently do it where we want it to. So when it comes to all of this, the kind of things that I like to think about is the fact that research is a very difficult, thing to do in psychology. But hopefully you've kind of got a quick overview about what psychology is, how we do research, and join us next time for when we talk about the biology of the brain, a very heavy chapter, but hopefully gives you an understanding of how we are just a brain, just like any other creature. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I hope you're all doing well. I wish you all the best of luck. Have a great day.